50 miles north from Berlin, the Reich constructed its most horrific concentration camp, Ravensbruck, a camp where female bodies became a testing ground for cruelty. Women and girls from across Europe were dragged in. Some had acid poured into their wounds, others were sewn together like dolls to study infection. Forced labor felt like mercy, and hunger carved through them like a slow knife. Every inch was engineered for suffering, while some faded in silence and others screamed until their throats bled. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. In 1938, Heinrich Himmler orchestrated something unprecedented: the construction of Ravensbruck, Nazi Germany's only concentration camp built exclusively for women. The Nazi regime needed a centralized facility to systematically destroy women they deemed undesirable, like political prisoners, resistance fighters, Roma, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone who dared defy their twisted ideology. Using prisoners as slave laborers, the SS cleared treacherous swampland and erected wooden barracks, watchtowers, and electrified fences that crackled with death. The location was strategically chosen, isolated enough to hide their atrocities from the world, yet connected by rail lines that would become arteries of human cargo from across occupied Europe. Construction workers hammered nails into what would become coffins for the living. Every plank of wood, every coil of barbed wire, was designed with one purpose: to create a machine for breaking the female spirit. The peaceful forests and lakes surrounding the site would soon echo with screams that would never fade. The first transport arrived in May 1939. 867 terrified women who stepped off cattle cars with no idea they were walking into a living hell. The moment their feet touched Ravensbrück's gravel, their former lives evaporated. They were stripped naked in front of leering guards, heads shaved until their skulls gleamed pale and vulnerable, reduced to numbers sewn onto prison uniforms with trembling fingers, wedding rings torn from swollen knuckles, photographs of children ripped from desperate hands, memories. Everything that made them human was incinerated in an instant, and the daily horrors were about to begin. Daily life at Ravensbrück was not an accident of war. It was a meticulously crafted system of torment. The camp was created to annihilate women without the noise of gunfire or the speed of bullets. Death wasn't the goal, not at first. The Nazis wanted something slower, more methodical. They wanted to obliterate hope, turn human beings into ghosts before the body gave out. And so, Ravensbrück became a factory, not just of forced labor, but of psychological disintegration. Each day began with a siren at 3:15 a.m. that cut through the blackness like a knife. Prisoners were forced from wooden barracks where 200 women shared space built for a fraction of that number. They lined up in the gravel yard for roll call, which could last hours. Snow fell, sun scorched, and guards miscounted on purpose, extending the agony. No one was allowed to speak. No one was allowed to move. Collapse meant punishment. Movement meant beatings. Those dragged away rarely came back. Those who stayed were already fading. The camp's cruelty wasn't only in its routines, it lived in the people who carried them out. The female guards, called Aufseherinnen, were not monsters by birth. They had once been maids, clerks, mothers, but uniform and power turned them into sadists. Within weeks, their humanity vanished. They shouted, struck, kicked, relishing the control they had over the broken bodies before them. Food was starvation masquerading as sustenance. A ladle of thin, greasy liquid with floating cabbage bits. A crumbling slice of black bread, sometimes moldy. It was enough to keep the women breathing, but not enough to keep them living. Their bodies began devouring themselves. First fat, then muscle, then organs. Hair fell out. Bones tore through skin. Teeth rotted and dropped from bleeding gums. They didn't walk anymore. They drifted. Disease didn't need help to spread. It thrived. With no soap, no clean water, no working toilets, lice and infection spread faster than rumors. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Women soiled themselves, lay in piles, breathing in filth, begging for death. None of this was oversight. It was intention. Starvation, filth, humiliation, They were part of the architecture. Dignity was stripped first. Life followed soon after. By the end of the first year, nearly 50 women died every day. Without bullets, without gas, just silence, just hunger, just Ravensbruck. But the physical suffering was nothing compared to what the Nazi doctors had planned. In 1942, Ravensbruck descended into a new tier of calculated horror. No longer content with starvation and labor, the Nazis began using the camp as a laboratory for live human experimentation. Under orders from Heinrich Himmler, SS physician Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Hitler's personal doctor, was dispatched to test experimental treatments for battlefield injuries. But these were not medical trials. They were carefully choreographed acts of mutilation designed to torture under the pretense of science. Gebhardt handpicked 86 healthy young Polish women, mostly political prisoners, and labeled them as test subjects. They were nicknamed the Rabbits, not for their innocence, but for their fate as disposable specimens. One by one, they were brought into the camp's operating rooms. There, without anesthesia, doctors sliced open their legs, fractured bones with hammers, and carved muscle away from the bone. Wounds were intentionally infected using bacteria, dirt, splinters, and even rusty nails to simulate battlefield contamination. The aim was to test sulfur drugs. The reality was medieval mutilation dressed up in modern medicine. The victims' bodies responded with swelling, fever, and sepsis. Flesh turned black. Limbs ballooned to grotesque sizes. Many bled to death, while others died slowly over days of unrelenting agony. Some women were subjected to repeated surgeries. Others endured bone transplants, their limbs cut and swapped like spare parts. A few survived, but most were left permanently crippled, unable to walk, labor, or even stand. Their shattered legs became death sentences in a camp where weakness meant elimination. And yet, Ravensbruck's medical horror had more depths to explore. Dr. Herta Oberheiser, Gebhardt's assistant, specialized in chemical torture. She injected prisoners with experimental substances masked as vitamin treatments. Pregnant inmates were subjected to forced abortions or dissected alive to monitor fetal development. Her patients screamed through cesarean sections performed without sedation. Their suffering was methodically recorded in files that the Nazis would later call research. These experiments weren't about science. They were about supremacy, proving that the Nazis could dominate not just nations, but bodies. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy of scars that no scalpel could erase. Yet even this nightmare paled in comparison to what happened in the children's quarters. The Kinderzimmer, or children's room, was not a nursery, but a death chamber, where infants born to camp prisoners were condemned, not through violence, but through calculated neglect. By 1944, as more pregnant women were deported to Ravensbruck, the Nazis shifted strategy, not to prevent births, but to permit them under the condition that the children would not survive. The purpose was control, a demographic solution executed through deliberate starvation. Nazi policy dictated that children born in concentration camps, particularly those of Jewish, Roma, or Polish mothers, had no place in the envisioned racial order. Allowing these babies to die naturally, without food, warmth, or medical care, was seen as more efficient than active killing. Orders were issued to provide no extra rations, no medical assistance, and no heating. The infants were placed in iron cots, sometimes 4 or 5 to a bed, and left in unheated rooms where the temperature could drop below freezing. Starving mothers, themselves emaciated and overworked, were forbidden from nursing. They received no additional food and often produced no milk. Despite this, acts of maternal defiance emerged. Women shared what little nourishment they had, offered their breast milk to strangers' children, passed crumbs between cribs, and hummed lullabies to dying infants in an attempt to offer comfort amid despair. But nothing could combat the systematic deprivation. Babies died within days or weeks. Most never received a name. Their bodies were collected daily without ceremony, loaded onto carts, and disposed of like trash. SS guards did not interfere. They did not have to. The Kinderzimmer functioned exactly as intended, death by neglect, without the inconvenience of bullets or gas. The children's room was not an aberration. it was policy. A silent genocide executed through starvation, proving the Nazis' cruelty extended even to the smallest, most defenseless victims of the regime. But as the war reached its climax, even greater horrors awaited. Buried within the stone belly of Ravensbruck stood the bunker, not a shelter, but a dungeon, meticulously engineered to destroy. It wasn't simply a prison inside a prison, it was the camp's iron fist, the place where Nazi brutality was distilled into its purest form. This wasn't punishment for crime, it was terror for control. The bunker existed to crush resistance, erase defiance, and broadcast one brutal truth: there would be no mercy here. The logic behind it was psychological warfare. As uprisings simmered in other camps and whispers of rebellion crept through Ravensbruck's barracks, the SS sought a tool more intimate than bullets, more terrifying than gas. The bunker became that weapon. Hidden behind thick concrete walls, it housed solitary cells barely large enough to lie down in. Women were thrown into them for infractions as trivial as sharing food or making eye contact with a guard. Once inside, they vanished from the camp's world, forgotten, isolated, and broken in silence. The methods used within were not improvisations, they were policies. Starvation, beatings, and water torture were standard. Prisoners were locked for days in cells flooded with freezing water, forced to stand as their limbs swelled, blackened, and began to rot from frostbite. Others were strapped to walls, whipped until skin peeled in ribbons. But the cruelty didn't end with pain. It fed on humiliation. Public floggings were staged deliberately. Naked women were dragged to the roll call square, lashed in front of thousands. SS officials knew 20 lashes could kill. They gave 55. The aim wasn't just punishment, it was domination. Spectacle became strategy, turning bodies into warnings. Inside the bunker, interrogation meant torture cloaked in bureaucracy. Heated irons were pressed against skin, fingernails torn out with pliers, eyes punctured with needles. Women passed out from agony, only to be revived and tortured again. The gallows stood nearby, a permanent fixture. Women were hanged for stealing scraps of food or murmuring to a friend. Their corpses dangled for days, rotting in full view. Mothers were forced to watch daughters suffer. Sisters watched sisters scream. The message was clear: your body belongs to the Reich, your pain is a tool, and your hope is treason. In the bunker, even death was weaponized, but the killing machine was accelerating toward a new level of horror. Approaching the final winter of the Third Reich, Ravensbruck crossed its last threshold into systematic annihilation. What had begun as a forced labor camp for women evolved into a site of industrialized murder. As the Red Army pressed westward and Nazi control collapsed, the SS made one final, frenzied decision: to eliminate the evidence. A gas chamber was built not to win the war, but to erase its crimes. The reasoning was cold and logistical. With liberation imminent, thousands of sick, starving, and emaciated prisoners stood as living proof of Nazi atrocities. Witnesses had to vanish. Orders came to increase the tempo of death. The solution was swift: a gas chamber disguised as a shower, constructed near the crematorium to facilitate mass killing and disposal in a single location. The chamber, hastily erected in a wooden outbuilding, was modest in design but lethal in function. Every morning, trucks pulled up to the camp infirmary. Inside were the marked: women too ill to work, children too young to survive, elderly prisoners too weak to stand. Names were listed with bureaucratic precision, selections made by SS officers who read from charts as if assigning work duties. But these charts were death warrants. The condemned were told they were being sent to bathe or receive medical care. Instead, they were led to the gas chamber, up to 180 at a time, sealed inside, and gassed with Zyklon B. Within minutes, every sound was gone. Cremation followed immediately. Bodies were burned in the adjacent ovens, their ashes dumped and scattered to obliterate all trace. The process became mechanical. Lists were typed, trucks followed a schedule, guards carried out tasks with rehearsed indifference. Killing had become a clerical routine, a final chapter in the Nazi project to dehumanize every victim, right up to their last breath. In those final weeks, Ravensbruck wasn't collapsing, it was accelerating. Even as Allied tanks approached, the camp was a factory of death running at full speed. And behind its barbed wire, every sunrise brought selections, every sunset brought ash. Meanwhile, remarkable acts of defiance continued even in these final days. The camp was designed to erase identity, but even surrounded by death, prisoners chose defiance, not through violence, but through intellect, solidarity, and the refusal to forget who they were. The reason was survival, not just of the body, but of the soul. The Nazis sought to reduce these women to numbers, to ash. Resistance became a way to reclaim personhood. Every quiet act of rebellion was a declaration. You will not own us. In a place where speech could cost your life, courage often came in silence. Resistance took many forms. Hidden schools were formed in corners of barracks, where former teachers and students traded knowledge like currency. French women taught Shakespeare. Polish prisoners recited poetry from memory. Russian inmates diagrammed math problems in the dirt. At night, lessons were whispered beneath blankets, while guards patrolled outside. Sabotage ran through the Siemens factory, where prisoners were forced to build military components. Women rewired circuits to fail in battle, dulled blades, and damaged fuses. In the textile workshops, they deliberately stitched faults into German uniforms, knowing that a crooked seam could sabotage a soldier's gear. These small acts accumulated, undetected, but not unimportant. Communication beyond the fences was another front. Inmates wrote secret messages in invisible ink, made from urine or diluted soap, and smuggled them out via labor transport convoys. These notes informed the Allies of Ravensbruck CK's horrors and helped expose Nazi crimes before the war even ended. Some were folded into seams of clothing. Others were memorized and whispered to new arrivals destined for other camps. Creative resistance also flourished. In scraps of cloth, women fashioned tiny dolls for one another. They wove bracelets from threads pulled from their own uniforms. Others crafted songs and plays, performing quietly in dark corners, their voices fragile but filled with life. Every stitch, every lyric, every quiet performance was an act of rebellion. In the face of annihilation, these women built a network of memory, defiance, and dignity. Ravensbruck tried to break them, but in resisting, they proved that even in the darkest place, humanity could still burn bright. But time was running out for the Third Reich. In the final, desperate days of April 1945, as the Soviet army closed in on Nazi Germany's crumbling empire, Ravensbruck descended into chaos. The SS scrambled to erase the traces of mass murder by fleeing, killing, and silencing. They forced thousands of prisoners onto brutal death marches, executed the weak, and tried to evacuate others under a pretense of humanitarian concern. Liberation was at hand, but so was one final campaign of cruelty. The goal was concealment. The Nazis feared accountability. With the Allies closing in, they sought to destroy every living witness to their crimes. Heinrich Himmler, desperate to salvage political power, authorized evacuations that favored Western prisoners, while leaving the majority to die or be hidden. The SS command wanted to vanish into the fog of war, their atrocities buried with their victims. About 7,500 prisoners, mostly Western Europeans, were selected for evacuation under the protection of the Swedish Red Cross. They boarded the famous white buses, organized by Count Folke Bernadotte, and were transported to neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. These transfers were filmed and photographed, giving the illusion of humane surrender. But for more than 20,000 others, there was no rescue, ordered to march westward into the forests of Mecklenburg. Starving women with swollen legs and open wounds were driven at gunpoint through freezing weather, collapsing on roadsides as SS guards shot or abandoned them. Survivors recalled dragging the bodies of friends, terrified they'd be next. On the 30th of April, the day Adolf Hitler died, Soviet troops finally reached the gates of Ravensbruck. What they found defied comprehension. Fewer than 2,000 prisoners remained, most lying unconscious or too weak to speak. Some were blind, others deaf, all skeletal. The camp was eerily quiet. Piles of ashes smoldered near the crematorium, bunks were soaked in urine and blood, and hundreds of corpses were scattered across the grounds. Unlike the liberations of Buchenwald or Dachau, there were no Allied film crews to record this moment, no grand announcements. The world turned its attention to Berlin, leaving Ravensbruck in the shadows. The silence that greeted its survivors wasn't just physical, it was historical. Many would die within days from disease, untreated wounds, or malnutrition. Others would return home only to face rejection, trauma, or silence from nations unwilling to hear the truth. Nevertheless, the survivors remembered everything.
Placed in a big tent when we entered the dreadful camp. The ground was all grey and black and so terrible. When you saw the people in there, they were just skeletons, it was dreadful.
For those who survived Ravensbruck, liberation was only the beginning of torment. Many were too weak to care for themselves, dying in the weeks following rescue from disease and exhaustion. Dr. Doris Maase, a camp physician, spent years regaining enough strength to walk.
On a l'impression d'être dans un monde de folie, d'horreur. On a vécu avec la mort. J'ai fait de la résistance plutôt très jeune, parce que dans ma famille, on n'a pas accepté du tout la présence des Allemands. Puis j'ai été arrêtée, déportée. J'ai retrouvé ma mère à Ravensbruck.
The psychological scars ran deeper than wounds. Survivors carried the memory of midnight screams, corpses piled like cordwood, the smell of burning flesh.
À boire, c'est terrible, manquer, avoir soif, jusqu'à en mourir. Ce que j'appelle la main tendue. C'était pas des choses extravagantes, on n'avait rien. C'est pas compliqué. Avec rien, qu'est-ce que vous faites?
These images haunted dreams, a permanent brand of trauma no time could heal. Today, Ravensbruck stands as a memorial, its exhibits displaying artifacts of suffering, a scorched shoe, a spoon, a Star of David torn from a dress. The names of all women who died are preserved, each representing a story of terror. More than 70 years later, Ravensbruck asks disturbing questions about human nature. How could women guards choose such cruelty? What does it mean that a place for protection became a factory of death? The guards chose cruelty. The prisoners, against odds, often chose compassion. In that razor-wire shadow, small kindness became heroic, defiance sacred, survival resistance. As one survivor said, even amid the cruelty, people must stay people. We've journeyed through one of history's most horrific chapters, from the camp's sinister origins to its forgotten liberation. We've witnessed medical torture disguised as science, systematic infant murder, and gas chambers hidden as shower rooms. But we've also seen incredible acts of resistance, compassion, and survival against impossible odds. The story of Ravensbruck exceeds every expectation of human cruelty, yet also transcends every limit of human courage. These women faced the absolute worst of humanity and somehow kept their own humanity intact. The shadows of Ravensbruck will haunt us forever, and they should. Now, we want to hear from you. After everything you've seen and heard, what disturbed you the most? What stayed with you? Drop a comment below as an act of remembrance. Let's make sure these voices are never silenced again.